Well, welcome back, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled you've joined me for today's explainer. Pull up a chair, because today we are stepping into a rather dark, incredibly profound mythological fable. I want you to imagine, if you will, the frozen silence of the mind's very first dawn. Out there, in that cold primordial space, lived a figure known as Cynos the Pale Cynic. Cynos wasn't just a regular character, he was a creature of pure, cold intellect. As we trace his story today, we're going to explore the ultimate collapse of rigid order and what happens when the intellect desperately tries to cage the infinite. So, settle in. Class is officially in session.
Right off the bat, you need to understand how Cynos looked at the universe. He gazed out at this incredibly vibrant, dynamic dance of stars and energy, and do you know what he saw? He saw a meaningless error. Literally. He looked at the sheer majesty of existence and completely dismissed it as a tasteless broth. The sheer arrogance of that view, right? It perfectly establishes the Gothic, deeply foreboding tone of our theatrical tragedy today. Cynos wholly rejected the beauty of chaos and motion, opting instead for a cold and frankly rather pompous dismissal of life itself.
So, let's raise the curtain on Act 1, the illusion of static control. Okay, let's dive into this. How did this cynical worldview actually manifest? Well, it birthed an absolute, all-consuming obsession with rigid, unyielding order. On one side of this philosophical map, we have Cynos's public persona. He presented himself to the universe as the architect of the void, draped in these black, mocking priestly robes. He championed static control and pale, cold intellect. But directly opposed to this, and something that deeply terrified him, was the all-consuming maw. The maw represented blood-slicked chaos, raw hunger, and the dark, fertile ground of existence. The entire crux of our fable rests on this stark contrast between his pale intellect and the raw, untamed hunger of the void. Which brings us to the physical manifestations of his regime. Let's look at his monuments of failing security. To enforce his philosophy, Cynos didn't just preach, the man built. He constructed these grand, grim mental fortresses made of Apollonian gaskets and gilded cages of logic. His goal was literally to trap the universe in a vault of frozen perfection. But we have to ask ourselves, were these structures actually powerful? No, not at all. The fascinating psychological truth is that this outward show of unearned majesty was just an elaborate stage play for the void. These weren't strongholds. They were physical monuments to his failing mental security, a desperate defense mechanism driven by a deep, hollow fear of the unknown. Terrified of the chaos, he tried to cage it in pure logic. Let's lower the curtain on that illusion of order and open Act 2 to reveal the visceral, hidden truth, the hypocrisy of the mask. Because beneath those heavy robes, and behind all those gilded cages, there was a profound, shocking reality. Behold, the crimson mask. While his public robes preached stasis and cold logic, this mask was his closely guarded secret. It was secretly wedded to the very blood-slicked chaos that he publicly claimed to despise so fiercely. You might be wondering, why on earth did he wear it? Well, the mask wasn't just a clever disguise, it was a ritualistic bridge. It served as a direct conduit between his cold intellect and the raw hunger of the all-consuming maw. By wearing it, he kept himself tethered to the exact chaos he was desperately trying to bridle. It allowed him to maintain his grand facade as the master of logic, all while secretly preparing a final, terrible sacrifice. His highly touted protective walls were never meant to protect anything. They were always designed to be an altar for the void. And that brings us to the specific, completely flawed mechanism he used to govern his reality, the disappearing cosmic creed. Let's walk through this dark, absurd process step by step. First, the architect authored his supposedly immutable master architecture, the creed of the cosmic mind. Second, he signed this contract with the id, a move born entirely out of his deep, hollow fear. But here is the genius and the tragic irony of step 3. He drafted these ironclad rules in disappearing ink. Actually, think about that for a second. He intentionally designed his rigid, logical cage to be a temporary tomb of his own making. Step 4 was simply to sit back and wait for the logic of the mind to inevitably melt back into the dark, fertile ground of the void. Because that ink was always destined to fade, the cosmic page of his grand design would inevitably be left utterly blank. Think about the existential irony there. He built the ultimate structure of control, fully knowing it would vanish, leaving a completely blank slate
for the all-consuming maw to freely and hungrily consume. And now we reach the grand finale, Act 3, The Unbinding. This marks the catastrophic arrival of the wit and the total, spectacular collapse of the architect's rigid order. Let's chart the inevitable decay of his logical cage. Epoch 1 starts with the drafting in disappearing ink. Epoch 2 is the quiet, slow fading of that ink. You can almost feel the tension building as the stasis begins to weaken. Then, in Epoch 3, the heavy silence is completely shattered by the arrival of the wit's laughter, leading directly into Epoch 4, the final, terrifying unmasking of the maw. Suddenly, the pacing shifts. It's fast, it's chaotic. The wit brings the unbinding power of the absurd. Their laughter acts as a literal, jagged blade, slicing right through the heavy silence of the mind's dawn. And as that laughter echoes, the architect's gilded cages of logic are violently peeled away like dead skin. The illusion of control is absolutely shredded in an instant.
And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate downfall of Cynos. Just look at the stark contrast between his initial obsession with static control and his incredibly colorful death in the Crucible. His so-called immutable master architecture simply melted into the logic of the Crucible. His grand authority as the last thinker was completely stripped away, reducing him to a mere submissive witness. And that vault of frozen perfection he wanted so badly, it dissolved right back into the infinite, chaotic motion of the tasteless broth he had hated from the very beginning. The aftermath is a terrifying shift from cold intellect to raw hunger. His grim mental fortress completely transforms into a surreal playhouse. The crimson mask he wore so secretly is finally unmasked, revealing itself to be the true face of the maw. And Cynos, the great architect, is doomed to perform a perpetual grave dance upon the ruins of his own logic, serving as a submissive witness while the spirit of becoming finally feeds the eternal hunger that his logic could never, ever satisfy. Which leaves us with a rather profound existential lesson from the Stark fable. We've seen how the grandest illusions of static control ultimately collapsed into the dark, fertile ground of the void. So I leave you with this to ponder. If even the architect's gilded cages melted away into nothing, what rigid structures are you building to hide from your own inner chaos? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating mythology with me today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and please, don't be afraid of the vibrant dance of the stars.